You are listening to That's Life, a One Love media production.
The following episode of That's Life contains descriptions of abuse, murder, sexual assault, and human trafficking, and may be disturbing to some. Listener discretion is advised.
There are some stories that don't make the headlines as often as they should. Some injustices that don't get the outcry they deserve. And some communities that time and time again are left to fight for justice on their own. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most heartbreaking and outrageous crises in North America. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW. Indigenous women are disappearing at an alarming rate. And the response? Silence. Or worse, indifference. Law enforcement dismisses cases. The media barely covers them. And the families? They're left searching, fighting, and demanding answers in a system that seems determined to ignore them. But today, we're not ignoring it. Today, I am pulling back the curtain, exposing the truth, and asking the hard questions. Why is this happening? Who's responsible? And more importantly, what can be done to stop it? And why hasn't it stopped yet? This isn't just a conversation. Today is a call for action. Because justice isn't justice if it's only for some. We know that when someone goes missing, it's a crisis. But for Indigenous women, the crisis is often met with indifference. The numbers are staggering and heartbreaking. According to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to be murdered than any other group in the United States. And while there's no official count, some estimates suggest that over 5,700 Indigenous women have gone missing in the last few decades. Yet these cases are routinely underreported and underinvestigated. Reports also show that only 50% of cases involving Indigenous women are entered into the National Crime Information Center database, or the NCIC, leaving a massive gap in tracking these disappearances. How can we solve a problem when we don't even have accurate data to start with? It's not just a lack of action. It's systemic neglect. In many cases, local law enforcement doesn't take these cases seriously enough, leaving families without answers and the law without leads. According to a 2020 study by the Urban Indian Health Institute, there were 506 reported cases of murdered Indigenous women in 2016 alone. And these are just the ones we know about. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. Many cases are never recorded and remain unsolved. And it gets worse. These stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women rarely make national news. And when they do, the coverage is often short-lived. Media outlets, law enforcement, and even the public turn a blind eye, But Indigenous families are left to carry the weight of the search, often with little help from authorities. In fact, some families have said they felt outright dismissed by law enforcement. These women are treated like invisible victims in their own communities. And outside those communities, they're often forgotten. But let's take a step back here, because this isn't new. And we know this. This isn't some random failure of our justice system. No, this is a deep-rooted issue. Disappearance and murder of Indigenous women is a direct continuation of the historical erasure and oppression of Indigenous peoples in this country. And when I say erasure, I mean generations of stolen land, stolen children, and stolen lives. We can't talk about the MMIW crisis without acknowledging the deep scars left by the Trail of Tears and the decimation of entire cultures in the 19th century. Over 60,000 Indigenous people were forcibly relocated during the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from exposure, starvation, and disease. But what's even worse is that it was just one part of a centuries-long campaign to strip Indigenous people of their land, their heritage, and their rights. I want you to imagine this. Entire families wiped out. Mothers, daughters, children taken by both disease and deliberate neglect. And then just when they thought they had suffered enough, the American government stepped in and forcibly took their land. All of it ripped from them. That was supposed to be the end of it, right? That was supposed to be the low point. But the atrocities didn't stop, because even after losing their homes and their people, Indigenous women continued to be treated as disposable, an afterthought in a system that refused to even acknowledge their existence. Is it any wonder then that the same pattern continues today? The death of generations wasn't enough. Now it's the disappearance and murder of their women, the continued violation of their bodies and spirits, as though their lives are worth even less than the land that was stolen from them. This has never been about just missing people. This is about a culture and a community that has been systematically ignored and denied its humanity for centuries. And now, the very people who have been marginalized for generations are being forced to fight for their lives again. But this time, it's not just about survival. It's about recognition. It's about justice, and it's about demanding that Indigenous women no longer be overlooked or erased. So we've talked about the numbers, and we know the heartbreaking truth about how many women go missing or are murdered every year. But here's a bigger question. Why does this keep happening? Why is there such an alarming lack of urgency when it comes to investigating these cases? Well, let's start with the obvious. Law enforcement. The simple truth is that there's a systemic failure when it comes to responding to missing and murdered Indigenous women. Local law enforcement, especially in rural and remote areas where many Indigenous communities live, lacks the resources, the training, and the support to investigate these types of cases properly. In fact, there are numerous instances where local police fail to even file proper reports or take the initial steps to investigate a missing person report. In many cases, jurisdictional issues create even bigger barriers. You see, many indigenous communities are governed by tribal law, but if a crime occurs on tribal land, state or federal agencies often have to intervene, creating a bureaucratic mess that delays or prevents proper action. This confusion means that cases are left unresolved or mishandled, and families are left with no recourse. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. There's a history of law enforcement failing to prioritize cases involving Indigenous people, even when they do get reported. In fact, a 2019 report by the National Institute of Justice found that Indigenous women are often classified as runaways or voluntarily missing when they disappear, leading to delayed investigations and fewer resources dedicated to finding them. Law enforcement often treats these cases as less important than others, leaving families to pick up the pieces on their own. Some say this is a result of bias, that because Indigenous communities are marginalized and often in poverty, there's a deep-rooted prejudice in how these cases are treated. And this isn't just speculation. Research from Urban Indian Health Institute points to clear patterns of discriminatory practices and outright neglect in law enforcement's response to these crimes. But who's really responsible for all of this? Come on, that's an easy one. The government. They have a massive part to play in this ongoing crisis. Over the years, they've continuously failed to address the issues facing Indigenous communities, whether it's through a lack of investment in tribal law enforcement, failure to provide necessary training, or ignoring the warnings and pleas from family members. The FBI and other federal agencies, despite having a mandate to protect all citizens, often fail to treat the disappearance and murder of Indigenous women with the urgency it deserves. Even when investigations do happen, they're not always thorough. The FBI itself has come under fire for its lack of consistent follow-through on cases involving Indigenous women. The Justice Department has acknowledged that it has not dedicated enough resources to combating the MMIW crisis, often leaving cases to fall through the cracks. And even when an investigation does take place, the data collection process is often incomplete or not standardized, which only compounds the problem. It's easy to overlook these women when their stories aren't being told. The lack of media coverage, combined with systemic neglect from law enforcement, makes these cases even harder to solve. And when the system fails to prioritize their safety, it sends a dangerous message that their lives don't matter as much as others. But we can't and we won't afford to ignore this any longer. The longer we stay silent, the more women go missing. It's easy to look at statistics and feel detached. Numbers on a page don't have faces. They don't have voices. They don't have families who are still begging for answers. But behind every missing or murdered Indigenous woman is a life, a person who mattered. And because they matter, Today, I want to introduce you to just 3 of them. 3 women whose disappearances were met with silence instead of urgency. 3 women whose families are still fighting to be heard, because if we say their names, maybe, just maybe, the world will finally start listening. We're going to start with Emily Pike. She is from the San Carlos Apache tribe. Her age, 14. Case details. Emily Pike was a 14-year-old girl who went missing from a group home in Mesa, Arizona on January 27, 2025. Despite her family's urgent appeals and concerns, her dismembered remains were discovered 18 days later on Valentine's Day along a dirt road. Authorities ruled her death a homicide and identified 3 suspects, but their names have not been disclosed. Number 2, Mary Ellen Johnson Davis. From the Tulalip tribe. Age, 39. Available case details. Mary Ellen Johnson Davis disappeared in 2020. Her husband reported her missing before leaving the state and changing his phone number. Despite her family's persistent efforts and suspicions of foul play, little information has surfaced regarding her whereabouts. Her sisters believe she was abducted and possibly killed. The family's struggle to find answers is documented in the film Missing from Fire Trail Road, highlighting the broader epidemic of missing Native women. Amber Tuccaro, Tuccaro. She was from the Mikisew Cree First Nation tribe. Her age, 20. Available case details. Amber Tuccaro went missing on August 18th, 2010, after accepting a ride from an unknown man near Edmonton, Alberta. Her family reported her missing, but the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, initially did not take immediate action, suggesting she was probably out partying. 2 years later, her remains were discovered in a field in Leduc County. The RCMP faced criticism for their handling of the case, including delays in investigating and communicating with the family. Now that you know 3 of the names of the victims that are not being fought for, and now that we've explored why law enforcement continues to fail Indigenous women and how these cases are swept under the rug. Next, let's dive into the theories that may explain why this crisis exists in the first place and who might be responsible for perpetuating it. First off, historical trauma plays a major role in this. We can't talk about the MMIW crisis without acknowledging the long history of colonization and violence that Indigenous people have faced since Europeans first arrived on this continent. The forced displacement of entire communities, the systemic abuse, and the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples have left deep scars that continue to impact every aspect of their lives, even today. The loss of land, culture, self-determination wasn't just an event. It was a deliberate strategy aimed at erasing an entire people. And the result of that strategy is a legacy of economic hardship, violence, and displacement that Indigenous communities are still grappling with. Indigenous women, as the backbones of their families and communities, have been disproportionately impacted by this ongoing trauma. Another theory is that the exploitation of Indigenous women is deeply tied to racialized violence. Indigenous women are often viewed as easy targets, largely because of how they've been dehumanized and forgotten by society. Historically, the U.S. government and settlers viewed native land as vacant, as though the indigenous people didn't matter. So it stands to reason that the same mindset continues today. Indigenous women are seen as disposable, their lives viewed as less valuable than others. But there's also another piece to this puzzle: human trafficking. Indigenous women and girls are disproportionately affected by trafficking, especially in areas near major highways or tourist destinations. Predators know that these women are high risk for exploitation, and because these areas are often isolated and lack resources, the women are easy targets. This isn't just a random occurrence. It's about systematic abuse that thrives in the gaps left by society. So, who is responsible for this ongoing crisis? Well, in part, it's the institutional systems that perpetuate inequality: the justice system, law enforcement, the government, media outlets. They've all failed our Indigenous people to take action when it comes to protecting their women. They've been allowed to fade into the background, largely ignored or treated as an afterthought. But here's the good news: change is possible. And there are already efforts underway to address this crisis head on. The first one being the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, VAWA. That now includes provisions specifically designed to combat MMIW, including allowing tribal courts to prosecute non-native offenders in cases involving violence against Indigenous women. This is a major step forward, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. We also need to increase public awareness, because if people don't know what's happening, they can't advocate for change. We need media to start covering these cases with the same intensity that they would if the victims happened to be white. We need stories of missing Indigenous women to be reported, investigated, and followed up on, just like any other. Another critical piece of the solution is strengthening tribal sovereignty, ensuring that Indigenous communities have the resources and legal authority to manage their own safety and security. This includes better funding for tribal police departments, training law enforcement to handle these cases with the necessary urgency, and improving communications between federal, state, and tribal agencies. Also, education is key. By teaching people about the MMIW crisis and its historical roots, we can begin to dismantle the ignorance and indifference that allows this violence to persist. And while we're at it, we need to stop viewing Indigenous women as victims, because they're survivors and they deserve respect and justice. We need to listen to their stories and make sure they have a seat at the table when decisions are being made about their communities. Finally, we need accountability. If law enforcement agencies like the FBI don't take these cases seriously, we need to hold them accountable. We can't let another woman go missing or another family endure endless pain without support. This crisis is urgent. It's time to fight for real change. Because Indigenous women matter. Their stories matter, and we can't stop. And we won't stop until justice is done. As we come to the end of today's episode, it's impossible to ignore the magnitude of the issue at hand. Missing and murdered Indigenous women are not just statistics. They are real people with families, dreams, and futures that were violently taken from them. And while we've discussed the horrors of this crisis, we can't leave this conversation without talking about what we can all do to change it. First and foremost, we need to demand action from law enforcement. Not only that, but government agencies and the media. The systemic neglect of Indigenous women cannot continue. We have to hold authorities accountable for failing to act and push for better resources, more training, and stronger protocols for handling these cases. Whether it's through writing letters, signing petitions, or attending protests, our voices matter. Secondly, raise awareness. We can't allow the stories of these women to be buried in the shadows. Start conversations, share posts, and get informed. Educate yourself and those around you about the crisis of MMIW. Awareness is the first step in building momentum for change. If you live near an Indigenous community or have the privilege of interacting with Indigenous people, be mindful of the issues they face. Offer support. Stand with them. Stand beside them. Stand in front of them to shield them. Advocate for better conditions, for more resources, and for justice. Another way to help is by supporting organizations that are already fighting for justice. Groups like the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, or the NIWRC, and the MMIW movement work tirelessly to provide resources, raise awareness, and demand justice for Indigenous women. Donate, volunteer, or share their work. You can support. Your support can help amplify their efforts. And lastly, demand better media coverage. We need to hold journalists and news outlets accountable for failing to give these stories the coverage they deserve. Indigenous women deserve the same attention as anyone else. In my opinion, they deserve it more than anyone else. But they deserve it at least as much as anyone else. And what we need to do is raise our voices to ensure their stories are told. Every missing person matters. Emily Pike matters. Mary Ellen Johnson Davis matters. Amber Tuccaro matters. Every woman deserves justice. Before we wrap up, let's take a moment to reflect on the responsibility we each carry in making a change. It's easy to feel like one person can't make a difference, but the truth is, collective action is incredibly powerful. If we all do our part, whether that's listening, advocating, educating, or acting, we can help create a world where Indigenous women aren't overlooked and forgotten anymore. To everyone listening today, don't let this be the last time you think about MMIW. This is a crisis that affects all of us. We are all responsible for doing something about it, and together we can make a lasting impact. And to all the Indigenous women and Indigenous people that might be listening or might listen to this episode, know that I stand with you. Know that I will fight with you. Know that you are not alone, that there are people who are ready to help you fight. So, just thank you for joining us today and for being a part of this important conversation. Please share this episode with your friends and continue to raise your voice for those who have been silenced for far too long. Until next time, stand for justice. Stand for change. But whatever you do, just don't stand in my way. I'm Kyle Fields. Good night.
That's Life is hosted by Kyle Fields and written by Mary Rodriguez. Editing and production by One Love Media. All rights reserved. Like what you heard? Join the conversation. Follow us on social media and be part of the That's Life community. Want exclusive content? That's Life Members Lounge is now available for just $5 a month on Patreon. Get access to special episodes, expert interviews, and even request topics for future shows. Sign up at patreon.com/OneLoveFLA. And don't forget to check out our other shows. The Survivors Series, new episodes every Wednesday. Sunday Evening Reset, a powerful way to end your weekend, streaming every Sunday night. See you next week for another episode of That's Life.